don't expand our imagination.
Justification for being what you are.
And welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm Bob Schieffer, sitting in today for Jan Crawford, who's usually here on Tuesdays. Well, the trial at Guantanamo Bay for the prison's youngest detainee is now underway, and it is also the first of those trials that since President Obama took office. We're going to have a roundtable with the former State Department legal advisor under President Bush, John Bellinger, and Amnesty International's Tom Parker. Then we're going to go to the Chicago Sun-Times and Politics Daily's Lynn with the real story behind First Lady Michelle Obama's trip to Spain over the weekend. But first, John Bellinger and Tom Parker on the first trial at Guantanamo under the Obama administration. And Mr. Bellinger, I would just say this is the way the Bush administration wanted to do it, isn't it?
Well, there's been, I think, a lot more continuity than change than people really expected. A lot of people are still being detained under the laws of war without criminal trials. Guantanamo is still open, and the military commissions, which people expected to be jettisoned, are still being used. This comes as a surprise and a disappointment, I think, to European allies. Personally, I had hoped that Guantanamo would be closed by now, and have been surprised that even a democratically controlled Congress has not backed the president in his efforts to do so.
But this is the way the Bush administration wanted to do it, before a military tribunal. But there is some question as to why you would pick this particular case. This defendant was 15 years old when I guess he threw a hand grenade at someone. Very serious crime, but it would not be, a lot of people would say, the ideal case to make the first one, to see how it's all going to work.
Well, I think it's a two-edged sword. I mean, one, the Bush administration always had expected that they didn't want to start with the big fish. They wanted to start with smaller fry to essentially get the kinks out of the system. As I say, this is a two-edged sword, though. On the one hand, this was someone who actually was captured on the battlefield. He was not someone who was far from the battlefield. He was from a well-known al-Qaeda family, no question about that. And he killed, or allegedly killed, a identified and specific soldier. In that case, it's a somewhat easier case. On the other hand, he was 15 years old when he did it, and that has resulted in a huge hue and cry in the international community about the alleged trial of a child soldier.
Well, Tom Parker, what's your take on this?
Well, I think the points of the case are worth dwelling on for a second. He was 15 years old when he was picked up. He was picked up on the battlefield. It's not clear whether he threw the hand grenade or not. There's no eyewitness that saw him do it. He was shot twice at the point of capture. He was wounded a number of times by shrapnel. He lost an eye. He was interrogated in pretty unpleasant circumstances in Bagram. The only real evidence that the government's introduced against him is confessions that have come out of that period of interrogation. There is a video showing him preparing an IED in a training exercise, but you have to remember, at the end of the day, this is a 15-year-old kid surrounded by some very hard men in a very dangerous part of the world. And you're asking a lot of a 15-year-old in Afghanistan in a war to make smart decisions.
Well, what would you do with him?
I would release him.
Just release him?
If you can't charge him in federal court, that's what we do.
And you think he can't get a fair trial in this tribunal? What?
I don't think he gets, I don't think he should be tried before this tribunal. I don't think that inventing a new court because you cannot take evidence to a federal court is a very smart way to proceed. I don't think this is a very edifying spectacle, and I don't think it reflects well on American justice, and it certainly isn't perceived as a very fair process around the world. That said, I do think the military is trying.
Well, I mean,
should
he just not be held accountable for this? I mean, when people do things like this, we just say, well, gosh, he's 15, guess we'll just send him home.
He's been held accountable for 8 years without trial, so it's not as if this kid has not already spent a lot of time in jail. But the bottom line is no one's proven he's committed an offense. You don't hold people for 8 years without trial.
Well, that's why we have trials.
Exactly.
Everybody that goes into court.
Should have taken him to a federal court,
generally,
charged him if he had the evidence, convicted him if he could present the evidence. That's how it works.
Well, one, we do actually hold people without trial in a war. I recognize, in fact, and that's been the great debate in this country and around the world for a long time, as to whether this is a traditional kind of war. But in a traditional kind of war, we do hold people without trying them. In this case, we think that this individual also committed a crime. He committed a war crime. He killed a soldier when he didn't have a right to be fighting that soldier. We now have a soldier who's dead and his family without their family member. And we try young people in U.S. courts all the time. We try 15-year-olds all the time. I mean, you could argue this is unfortunate. They may have had a bad upbringing. It may not literally have been their fault. It may have been their parents' fault for raising them a particular way. But we don't let people off the hook in this country simply because we say that they're 15 and they had a bad upbringing. It may be relevant in sentencing, but if he committed a crime like this, he ought to be held accountable.
Let me just ask both of you this. What is the difference between the proceeding that he'll go through there at Guantanamo and the proceeding that would take place in a federal court, say?
Well, they're actually not that different. The criticism all along has been that the military commissions will be incredibly different from federal courts, and there have been changes made over time. There were a number of us in the Bush administration tried very hard to make changes, which ultimately were. There will be a military judge who will run the trial and make legal decisions. There will be a jury of military officers who will hear the evidence. There will be a military prosecutor and a military defense counsel. The military judge, prosecutor, and defense are people who do military trials all the time. I don't say that these are not without some problems. On the other hand, they are not completely invented. The people who are running them, the men and women in our military, are responsible for running court-martials every day. And whatever concerns we have about military commissions, these are the men and women who actually dispense military justice every day in a fair way for decades. And I think to a certain extent, we need to trust them to do it. If we see they don't do a good job with it, then we can criticize. But I think simply saying that the theory of a military commission for a crime that's committed on a battlefield, and let's think about this the other way around, is a person who has rolled a hand grenade in the battlefield in the middle of a firefight, someone who should be tried in federal court. Is a group of New Yorkers going to be a jury of one's peers in that case? I support federal trials for the 9/11 planners. I think that's appropriate for them. But for some cases, for a crime, war crime that's been committed on the battlefield, a court-martial or military commission is not inappropriate.
So, Tom, what's your response to that?
There's a lot to unpack there. Let's start with the war crime first. I spent 4 years of my life as a war crimes investigator with the United Nations in the former Yugoslavia, in Kosovo and Iraq. Throwing a hand grenade at soldiers shooting at you is not a war crime. And we can argue about whether or not he was a privileged combatant, but a war crime is an absurd term for that.
Well, if somebody shot him, saw him rolling the hand grenade and shot him, would you say they shouldn't have
presumably
done that?
his option was to stay there with his hands up saying, I'm 15, and we would assume that he would not get hurt by the soldiers. He got shot 2 times, lost an eye, and got blown up. So clearly the soldiers that attacked the compound were shooting at him. That's a battlefield situation. I don't think a 15-year-old kid picking up a hand grenade on a battlefield, if he did that, which is not proven, I mean, that's the allegation, it's not proven. If he did that, is that a war crime? Of course it's not a war crime.
Well, why can't he get a fair trial before this tribunal rather than in federal court? Explain to me why you have an objection.
I think there were some really good points there. The first thing to say is, look, military lawyers, the JAGs, I do a lot of work with JAGs. They're very, very good at what they do. They're every bit as good as their civilian counterparts. In fact, watching them in court down at the commissions, they frequently run rings about their civilian counterparts. But there is a different character to a military court to a civilian court. I don't think you can argue that. The judge, for example, in Carter's case, has been very aggressive in what he's been admitting from the prosecution and not allowing the defense to rebut. I'm not quite sure that would necessarily go down quite that way in a civilian court. And then there's the optics of the thing. The commission's been changed, what, 3 times, 3 different sets of rules and procedures, 2 different laws through Congress. It's a constant shifting grounds. When Carter's last appearance in court took place, his lawyers were getting new rules and procedures of evidence the day before that they actually went into the courtroom. This isn't a court-martial. This is not the normal military system of justice. The lawyers in those courtrooms are learning as they go along how this process works, as opposed to federal trials where there's been 400 plus terrorism-related cases heard in federal courts since 9/11. Very successfully, no fuss, no scandal. Why wouldn't you turn to a system we know works?
All right. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank both of you. I don't think we'll settle this here today, but we will all be closely watching this to just see how it unfolds. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
First Lady Michelle Obama received a lot of attention last week, and it was not all good for taking a vacation to Spain with her daughter and a group of friends. While many criticized the timing of her ritzy vacation while the country is in an economic crisis, the Chicago Sun-Times and Politics Daily's Lynn is here to tell us the real story behind this international trip. Well, tell me about this, Lynn. I mean, she's not the First Lady who ever went on vacation.
No, she's not, but her timing was wrong and where she went was wrong. And I think, Bob, that's one of the reasons that she got in trouble on this trip. She has had a string of vacations this summer, and then she goes to Spain. Now, the reason that she went, the White House finally told me, was that she was going with a longtime personal friend, female and another female who and her buddy lost her father at the end of June or July. Mrs. Obama couldn't make the funeral. The friend wanted to go to Spain, so she went with her. Now, Mrs. Obama is politically savvy, so whatever is the outcome of helping a friend is something I think she understands she has to deal with now that she's back. But that's the setup of the trip. What caused this big public uproar is because she told people to go vacation on the coast of Florida, as did President Obama, and they're not going until this weekend. So she went on a trip to a Spanish beach before Florida beach to vacation. And it's tough economic times, and even though she pays her personal expenses, pays the equivalent of first-class airfare to go, her friends flew commercially, it still is a matter of messaging. And as you know in politics, perception is sometimes what dictates a conversation as much as anything else.
It's also a matter of money when you come right down to it. I mean, let's stop and think about this now. It's not when some of the president's family, it's not like just piling some stuff in the back of the station wagon and driving off.
Another reason that got a lot of...
I was told at one point that 70 Secret Service agents accompanied her on this trip.
I don't know the exact number because that's a closely held secret. That's why they call them Secret Service, but it's dozens and dozens. I mean, I was in Mexico with Mrs. Obama when she came there, and I saw dozens and dozens of people uniformed and plainclothes get off the plane. So and when you go to a place like that, you have 3 shifts. So that is true. And I'm not here to defend, but rather to explain, Bob, no matter where she goes on a trip, she's going to have dozens and dozens of security with her. The issue is the trip triggered extra costs. Whatever she paid for plane fare, Bob, does not come close to covering it. I know CBS has done reporting on the cost of the plane, and it doesn't cover the cost of her security detail and for having her staffers, though there were just 8 of them that came with. So there are costs.
It just sort of underlines, I mean, none of us begrudge the first family taking a little time off. Everybody needs a break every once in a while. But what I think the White House and the First Family, and I'm sure they've been reminded of it again this time, when they go on vacation, I mean, it is an enormous undertaking for the federal government, and the U.S. taxpayer pays for that.
Absolutely.
And this trip sort of underlined that. Have you heard anything from your sources at the White House to suggest maybe they now understand that maybe this was something that...
Well, here's what's interesting. Bob, I think they knew going... No, I think they knew going into it. My guess is that this is a very savvy White House. Day one, I wrote a story last week for Politics Daily where I talked about that this may raise some appearance problems for them. I filed that Wednesday morning. Lo and behold, Wednesday afternoon, Robert Gibbs is asked at the briefing, what about the appearance? Now, Gibbs said something that I think the White House thought would kind of give them a little distance from the story. He says, well, she's a private citizen, and this is a private trip. Well, Bob, Mrs. Obama is not a private citizen. No. She is a public figure. That is, she wasn't elected and she wasn't appointed, but my gosh, she got there because she's a spouse. So that was not, it didn't work out the way the White House thought by just saying it's a private trip could give cover. Every trip that a president and a spouse takes it goes under public scrutiny. This is not the first time. This is not for her special. If people think so, Mrs. Clinton's travels, Mrs. Bush's travels, people pay attention to this. People watch it, and where you go, and especially when you say go vacation in the Gulf, and then you go first to Maine, then you go to Spain, and this weekend they're going to Florida, and then they're going back to Martha's Vineyard for 10 days later this month. Well, when you look at a little more of this fuller context, you deal in politics, I do. Politics is perception, as I just said, and the perception is they're taking a lot of vacations, but just on the one point of helping out the Florida Gulf Coast, they're only going to go there for a day.
Lynn Sweet, who always tells us the inside story and always has a little something that we didn't know when she gets on a story. Well, thank you, Lynn, and thanks for watching Washington Unplugged. Also, catch my interview with Wycliffe John next week, right here on CBSNews.com. Bob Schieffer here. Have a great day.